welcome to all of you, the inaugural class of Justice X students and alumni. I'm Ben, and I'm a member of the teaching staff. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for joining us over the last few months. This class was just the first step, an experiment. Today's event will be split into two parts. For the first 40 minutes, Professor Sandel will answer your questions that receive the most votes from your fellow students. As Professor Sandel answers these questions, we encourage you to post follow-up questions and responses in the forum. For the last 20 minutes, Professor Sandel will reply to some of these questions and responses. Without further ado, let's begin. Professor, are you ready?
I am. Good to be here.
So the first question is from Sean. Sean explains that many of us are conditioned to believe that law is the ultimate good, when law oftentimes is meant to preserve the current system. He asks, how do we differentiate what is just from what is legal, specifically in the case of the actions of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden?
Right. Well, I found it very interesting, Ben, that quite a number of these questions, including some of the ones that got the most votes, had to do somehow or other with the Edward Snowden issue, which has been in the news lately and which does raise big questions about justice. I think the question Sean asks is a very important one. Clearly, there is a difference between figuring out what the law requires and figuring out the meaning of justice. There must be a difference between what's legal and what's just. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to have debates, as we often do, about whether this or that law is just or not. And the Snowden case raises a further question, which is beyond the question of the distinction between justice and law. And that's the question of civil disobedience. There's a long tradition of civil disobedience in which people who believe that a law is unjust violate the law as a way of making a political statement and promoting public discussion about the justice or injustice of the law. And so in analyzing the Snowden case, I think we have to analyze it as a case of civil disobedience. Is it a justified or unjustified instance of civil disobedience? Clearly, he was breaking the law in that he divulged secrets that under law were protected. But many people sympathize with what he did, even admire what he did, on the grounds that they agree with him that it's sufficiently important to reveal to the public the existence of this intelligence gathering system using telephone records and online email records of various kinds, that it's sufficiently important, the argument goes, to reveal the existence of that intelligence gathering system. So there can be a public debate about privacy rights and whether this system is defensible or not, such that if it is of compelling importance, then arguably this was an act of civil disobedience that was justified. Now, traditionally, civil disobedience involves a deliberate breaking of a law for the sake of making a public statement about the law's injustice. It typically involves the willingness of the lawbreaker to accept the consequences of his or her actions. So, for example, in the nonviolent civil disobedience of Martin Luther King during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the protesters were deliberately violating certain laws for the sake of protesting segregation. And they were willing to go to jail as a consequence of their act of civil disobedience. In fact, that was part of what gave their act of civil disobedience a kind of moral weight. Now, in Snowden's case, he's fled and is trying to find countries that will not return him to the U.S. to face criminal prosecution. It's understandable, though it makes it other than a classic case of civil disobedience. Still, there is the question, and this is a question I would like listeners now, if you're at a computer and willing to participate, I'd like to invite a response to this question. Is it justified what he did? Well, first part of the question is, was it important to reveal this intelligence gathering operation? I'd be interested in people's views on that question. And secondly, if it was it important enough to justify his breaking the law? Because that's really the way we would have to frame the question to decide whether we agree or disagree with what Snowden did. Since we're going to have an opportunity after this first round of questions to hear what people have to say, I'd be very interested if those of you listening would post your views about the Snowden action so we can have a further conversation before we finish.
I should say that there were a great many questions about this controversy. There are a lot of different dimensions to this problem, or to this question. And so I just wanted to also include that Dan asked another highly voted question, which is sort of, I think, in line with the first question. So I think we can skip over that. But if you think that he raises a point that needs to be addressed, then please, within either the first, either within Dan's or within Sean's question thread, please post a response.
Yeah, and I noticed that 3 or 4 of the top voted questions had something or other to do with the Snowden action. So it would be good if people could add the further some reactions to what I've said, as well as their own views about the Snowden action, so we can continue this discussion toward the end of the session.
Absolutely. The second question comes from Arjane, who asks, what makes my life more important than another organism's life? Why is it okay to kill another organism, but it is not okay to kill another person?
Well, by organism, I assume that Arjane is referring to animals. Is there a moral distinction between killing a human being and killing a non-human animal?
Or even a bug. I think she actually referred to a bug in her question. So I think she...
Well, bugs are animals.
Oh, that's fair.
But you could, other organisms could include other living creatures, including non-animal living creatures.
Right.
Killing a tree, for example. Well, Kant's answer, and we discussed this in the course of the semester, Kant draws a very clear distinction between killing a person, a human being, and killing an animal on the following grounds. Kant says that human beings are rational beings, and in virtue of our capacity for reason, we are worthy of respect, worthy of human dignity. And so it's a moral wrong that violates human dignity and respect for persons to take a human life. And Kant includes taking the life of another person, or indeed committing suicide, taking one's own life. He sees that as a violation of respect for persons and for rational capacity. By Kant's standard, killing a non-human animal would not be a similar moral wrong for the following reason. At least many non-human animals lack rational capacity. And if that's the basis of respect, and if that's the basis of the moral injunction against killing, then the key question from Kant's point of view would be whether the animal is capable of reason, a bearer of rationality and therefore dignity. In the case of animals, Kant would say animals are sentient creatures. They're capable of feeling pain. And so one could make an argument against killing non-human animals if it involves inflicting pain. But that would be a different kind of moral consideration. And that would create, so the Kantian view creates a clear distinction between taking the life of a rational being and taking the life of a non-rational, non-human animal. Now, in the case, from a utilitarian point of view, what matters is sentience. What matters is the capacity for pleasure and for pain. And so from a utilitarian point of view, it would depend a lot on how painful was the killing. And a painless killing would be morally less objectionable than one that inflicted great pain, though one would have to take into account cutting off a life that could enjoy pleasure in the future. So these are two very different ways of evaluating the morality of killing, two ways that draw quite a distinction between the taking of a human life and the taking of the life of non-human animals. As for plants and organisms generally, well, if sentience matters, then we would have to ask whether organisms that don't feel pain when they're killed, is that morally less objectionable than killing animals who do feel pain, or whose future pleasure is cut off. So there, in a way, would be, if we're looking at organisms generally, there would be the question of the status of human life, the status of non-human animal life, and the status of non-sentient life, as in the case of plants, for example. And it is, I would just add that this is one issue that divides Kantians and utilitarians. So, for example, utilitarians sometimes are strong advocates of animal respect and animal rights and animal welfare on the grounds that what matters above all is sentience, the capacity for pleasure and pain. So some utilitarians, this is true of Peter Singer, going all the way back to Jeremy Bentham, have worried a lot about killing or harming or torturing animals because the primary concern of the utilitarian is with pleasure, with sentience, with the capacity for pleasure and pain.
The third question comes from Tim. He writes, I find Kant's categorical imperative to be a very compelling moral framework. However, all that I have read in psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence forces me to conclude that free will is an illusion. He asks, does rejection of free will necessitate rejection of the categorical imperative?
And the questioner was?
Tim.
Tim. Well, Tim raises a hard and a classic question of moral philosophy and a familiar challenge to Kant. I think Kant's answer to Tim's question would be this. I think Kant would say, Tim, what you've studied in your science classes or in your neuroscience classes might be overinterpreted. Kant thinks that science can't tell us whether we are free or not, ultimately. Tim is right in the premise of his question, that if there were no such thing as free will, then Kant's categorical imperative would not be possible. Because, as Tim implies, for Kant, to act according to the categorical imperative requires that I be capable of acting freely, not being determined by forces outside me. And if it's not possible ever to act freely in this sense, in Kant's sense, then the categorical imperative would not be possible. Put this another way, if we're not capable of freedom, neither are we capable of acting morally or of taking moral responsibility. That's why if a rock falls from a building and kills someone, we don't hold the rock responsible because we believe that the rock was, its motion was wholly determined by the laws of physics. So Tim wants to know, well, what if it turns out that the same is true of us? What if neuroscience discovers one day, or perhaps some say it's already discovered, that we are not capable of acting freely after all? Well, that would undermine Kant's categorical imperative, but Kant would have the following rejoinder. He would say, whether we're capable of freedom is not only or wholly a scientific question, because science can investigate the empirical world. It can map the brain in the case of cognitive neuroscience. it can find correlations between actions or we might undertake or feelings we might have, and this or that part of the brain lighting up. But I think Kant would say, even being able to track those correlations and to map those correlations does not answer the philosophical question whether we are capable of acting freely. Kant thinks that the argument for freedom is not a scientific or an empirical argument. We can't read out from the world, from any empirical findings, whether we're free or whether what we've done is moral. Morality passes judgment on the world. It can't be derived scientifically. And so Kant would say it's a mistake to think that science can tell us whether freedom is possible, just as it's a mistake to think that science can tell us the difference between right and wrong. Kant thinks that these are philosophical questions, ultimately, that they are necessary presuppositions of the possibility of freedom and of morality. And he doesn't think science can answer those questions. But Tim is right that many cognitive neuroscientists think that science one day or soon or maybe even now will be able to resolve these questions once and for all. Kant doesn't think so. And I think Kant has a point. But it'd be interesting too to see if there are some people, Ben, who would like to reply to this, because this is a fierce debate now, and people who debate the relation between the mind and the brain. So it'd be interesting to see if people want to post some responses to this.
Absolutely. I also have a message to the video crew. Some of the students on the boards are asking to turn up the mics a little bit. It's a little low for them, so if you don't mind. The next question, the fourth question, comes from Mitch. He writes, I was disappointed by the response of your Harvard class to your question about how to respond after discovering that your roommate is cheating. For many of us, doing the right thing sometimes feels emotionally difficult. We are confronted with a conflict between our sense of loyalty and our sense of right. So he asks, how would you respond if you discovered your roommate was cheating? And more broadly, if the Harvard students were reacting to mere emotions, is that right or wrong?
And the questioner is?
Mitch.
Mitch. So Mitch, I assume when Mitch says he was disappointed with the reaction, it's when I asked the students by a show of hands to say whether or not they would they think it would be the right thing to do to turn their roommate in for cheating. And on an exam, let's say, or maybe on a homework assignment. I don't remember which. And
I think it's an Ec 10 problem set.
Right, okay, an Ec 10 problem set, which is not an exam exactly, but it's a homework exercise. That's graded, isn't it? Or is it?
I believe so, yeah.
And many students raised their hands and said, no, they wouldn't. Although some students said there was a difference between what they thought they would do and what they believed the right thing to do was. But part of what the question was trying to get at is whether loyalty, standing by your roommate or your comrades or your fellow citizens, is just a kind of psychological, emotional tug that is unrelated to ethics or morality, or is loyalty sometimes a part of justice? That's the issue we're trying to get at with the cheating example. And there are lots of examples of this where the stakes are even higher. Go beyond the roommate case. Are there any obligations that we have to our country, to our fellow citizens, that derive from the sense that we share membership in a community, in a way of life, a shared way of life? Do we have special responsibilities to our fellow citizens, let's say, that we don't have to human beings as such? That was the issue we were trying to get at. in that class. So I myself don't think that loyalty and solidarity to particular communities are simply matters of emotion. I think they do sometimes have a moral dimension. And that gives rise to a hard question. If there is a moral claim on us, if there is sometimes an obligation to stand with our people or our fellow citizens or our friends, then can that obligation ever compete with universal duties of justice? In the cheating example, the duty to tell the truth or to be honest. And we considered a number of cases in the last few sessions of the class where it seems there can be a tension between the two, between universal duties on the one hand and obligations of membership or loyalty or solidarity on the other. And sometimes we considered, for example, the case of Whitey Bulger, who has since been captured and is now on trial here in Boston. You remember Whitey Bulger was charged with murders as an alleged mob leader. And his brother, who was president of the Massachusetts Senate and then president of the University of Massachusetts, refused to help investigators track down his brother, who was alleged to have committed these crimes out of loyalty. And we discussed that in one of the lectures, and the update is that Whitey Bulger has been apprehended and is now standing trial. Now, this poses a very sharp test for the ethic of loyalty, because here is someone, on the one hand, it's a brother, but on the other hand, it's someone who is alleged to have ordered and in some cases committed many murders. So I think our moral vocabulary would be impoverished if we didn't recognize that sometimes there may be an obligation of loyalty that competes with other obligations and duties. That's not to say there's an easy way of reconciling these competing obligations and duties, but I think it's very difficult to make sense of our moral lives without acknowledging that these obligations of loyalty may not just be a kind of weakness of will, a matter of feeling and emotion, but may actually stand for an important moral principle to do with solidarity and the special obligations we have for our family members and perhaps for our fellow citizens.
The next question comes from Peter. He cites a few examples, like the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and Aung San Suu Kyi, and the suffering of the North Koreans. And Peter asks the question, do we have a moral duty to help our fellow humans, specifically with regard to suffering in other parts of the world?
Yes, I think clearly we do. And one of the subjects one of the hard philosophical questions we discussed in the course is how best to give an account of the obligations we have to fellow human beings half a world away. Now, in the examples was it Peter?
Yes.
In the examples that Peter gave, Nelson Mandela, for example, these are heroic figures who are moral exemplars that inspire a kind of global ethic and inspire, I think, men and women to seek justice across national borders. That's part of what makes these figures moral heroes. They draw our attention to the indivisible character of justice. They draw our attention to the sense in which an injustice committed anywhere is of concern and should be of concern to all human beings, regardless of where they live. And the dignity with which Nelson Mandela carried out his protest against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and the way he bore himself when he was finally released from prison, and when he helped preside over the dismantling of apartheid and launched democracy in South Africa. I think this dignity is an inspiring example for people everywhere. So there is a powerful sense in which justice is indivisible, and injustice to one person anywhere should be of moral concern to people everywhere. Now, it's a further question how we can act, how we should act in the world in the face of the indivisibility of justice. And when it comes to acting in the world, there is the kind of tension we've just discussed between the special obligations we have to remedy injustices close to home, and also sometimes to remedy injustices committed in our name, even by political communities with which we disagree. We discussed, for example, the obligation that may reach across generations to remedy past injustice, historic injustices. So those are the particular settings of justice. And they may give rise to special obligations for those who share a common life or a common history or a sense of community. And it may seem sometimes that there's a tension between those particularist aspects of justice, the special burdens we have to remedy injustices close at home, and our general obligation to do justice in the world and to care about human beings as such. I don't think there's any single formula that can tell us once and for all how to reconcile, how to act in the face of those tensions. But I do think it's important to recognize, as Peter suggests by his question, that there is a universal dimension to justice, even though acting in the world, none of us is capable of setting right or remedying every injustice. Nonetheless, we shouldn't be, and morally can't be, morally opaque simply in virtue of distance.
The next question comes from Brian. He writes, how can we measure exactly what punishment is due to a person who committed a certain crime? What could be the standard measure? What could the standard measurement be? Because if there would be no standard measurement, it would mean that our current notion of justice is subjective, wouldn't it? And so to put the question more precisely,
right,
he asks basically, how objective is the current notion of justice, specifically as it relates to criminal punishment?
It's a difficult question. There are two ways of thinking about criminal punishment, about the purpose of criminal punishment. One is that its primary purpose is to deter future crime. And the other is that it is to give people what they deserve. That's the retributive rationale. And depending on whether you believe that the purpose of criminal punishment is retributive or to deter, or both, that will shape what counts as fair punishment. And this question is related to the philosophical views that we've discussed throughout the course. On a purely utilitarian view, the only rationale for criminal punishment is deterrence, to prevent this person from committing the crime in the future, and by punishing this person, to deter other people from committing a similar crime in the future. That's the only purpose from a utilitarian point of view, deterrence. And so by that measure, the appropriate punishment will be whatever inflicts necessary pain on the criminal to prevent him and other would-be criminals from doing that in the future. A heavier punishment would inflict, the utilitarian would argue, more pain than necessary to prevent a recurrence of the crime. Too little pain would let the criminal off too easily and therefore have the undesirable effect of not deterring the criminal or other would-be criminals in the future. So from a utilitarian point of view, deterrence is all that matters, and that would be the calculus. But from the standpoint of retributive theories of criminal justice, including that of Kant, but also others, it's not simply a matter of calculating pain and pleasure, costs and benefits, deterrent effects as against pain to the criminal. It's also a matter of trying to figure out who deserves what criminal acts reflect bad character such that the community should give expression to its moral outrage or opprobrium. And insofar as retribution is a legitimate purpose of criminal punishment, deciding what the punishment should be has to take account of the moral gravity of the crime, and that should be registered in the criminal punishment independent of retributive considerations. So the answer to the question really goes quite a long way toward taking us back to some fundamental disagreements among the philosophers about what the purpose of criminal punishment should be.
The next question is from Luis. It's also in the context of the NSA controversy.
Right.
But unlike the other, or it's slightly different from the rest of the other questions, I think there's a broader underlying point to it, which is, how do we know when our society isn't acting in accordance with our values, the espoused values, and what should we do about it?
And I assume Luis is referring, by putting this in the context of the NSA controversy, Luis is wondering, suppose the society, in this case unbeknownst to us, is gathering intelligence by looking at phone records and internet and online patterns of communication in a way that violates fundamental commitments to privacy that we have as a society held up as an important value.
That's right.
I take that to be the context of Luis's question. How do we know about it? And I suppose Luis is also asking, what should we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the answer to that question really goes to the debate that we're having now in the wake of the Snowden revelation. Not about Snowden himself, that was the earlier question, but about the policy, about the intelligence gathering itself. And there are some Americans who say this is inconsistent with American values of privacy, respect for personal privacy. There are others who say, no, so long as the government isn't actually listening into the phone calls or reading the content of the emails, then if it's effective in preventing terrorist attacks, then some argue it's justified. So this debate, the one we're having now in the wake of the Snowden revelations, is a good example of the kind of debate about whether the law or existing practices in intelligence gathering are in line with our values or at odds with them. And I think it's very difficult to say how those arguments should go just in the abstract, but I think it's clear and important, looking at the debate we're actually having, to see this as precisely a debate about whether this kind of intelligence gathering constitutes a violation of fundamental principles of privacy, or whether it's been carried forward with sufficient protections for individual privacy, such that the benefits that the administration has claimed in fighting terrorism are justified. That's really at the heart of the debate, and I think that debate is unresolved now. I think it's just beginning. And many people who who admire what Snowden did do so because they think we would not otherwise be having this debate about this intelligence gathering operation were it not for Snowden's revelation of it. But I'll be interested to see what people say and post, as I hope they are posting, online in reaction to the Snowden controversy, which has arisen in a number of these questions.
Absolutely. And they are posting. I've got a few sort of loaded up, but
okay.
we'll give
well,
five.
sure.
We'll ask. How about 2 more questions, and
Yeah.
then we'll move on to the
See what
second
people have
segment.
said. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Ed. He cites to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enumerates a number of rights shared by persons,
Right.
such as food, clothing, housing, and medical care.
Right.
He explains that in the United States, citizens must depend on charity, such as food banks and shelters, in order to satisfy those basic needs. So Ed asks, is the U.S. dependence on charity immoral?
And in the context of the Universal Declaration of Rights, I assume that what Ed is drawing our attention to is the contrast between what are sometimes called civil and political rights on the one hand, and social and economic rights on the other. Social and economic rights, typically referring to rights as enumerated in some of the Declaration of Human Rights, rights to health care, to food, to clothing, to housing. Rights that go beyond legal and civil and political rights, such as the right to free speech, the right not to be charged with a crime except on the presentation of a proper warrant, and so on. And this is a long debate, including a debate about the Declaration of Human Rights itself, whether these 2 different categories of rights should be put on a par and equally respected. And we had a similar debate in the justice course when we considered libertarian theories of justice, which draw a very sharp distinction between civil and political rights, the rights to free speech, for example, on the one hand, religious liberty, and on the other hand, social and economic rights, rights to housing and food and a minimum income and health care and education. Libertarians say, that, as we saw in the course, that there's a fundamental distinction between these 2 different claims. The first are requirements of liberty, but the second, the social and economic rights, according to the libertarian, are not rights at all, but they are they should be taken care of by the operation of the free market. Whereas others, as we saw, disagree. Others, including John Rawls, say that fundamentally to respect persons requires not only respecting civil rights and voting rights and the right to religious liberty, but also seeing to it that no one is deprived of essential necessities such as food and shelter and health and education. And so to go back to, I think that's the setting and that's the philosophical framework of Ed's question. Is it Ed who asked that? Now, as for the role of private charity, if you believe that everyone has a human right to the essential provision of essential needs, food, shelter, clothing, health care, and the like, then it would be a further question whether the best way to fulfill those rights would be through private charity or through public provision of some kind or other. And unless you're a libertarian, you're likely to think that there is a role for public provision in assuring that everyone has access to essential goods. But this is a live question philosophically, as we saw and as we explored at some length when we looked at the contrast between libertarian theories of justice and those such as Rawls that argue there is an obligation to provide everyone for fundamental primary goods, which would give rise to the kind of social and economic rights that are listed in the Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay, and our final question is from Dan. But before we get to him, I want to apologize to the rest who have been listed above, we just kind of ran out of time, and there were
Go
a number
ahead.
of students who, were writing from Iran and Greece and Montreal. So I apologize to them.
Let's hear the one from Iran.
Oh, sure. Okay. So Bazad writes, he lives in Iran. He explains that there, someone who protests can be subject to severe criminal penalty. Bazad asks, what is the right thing to do when doing it could mean going to jail?
Well, it's a powerful and it's a poignant question, and I would just say to begin with, it's gratifying and it's exciting to think that the justice course has been viewed and studied and taken by Bazad and others in Iran and other parts of the world, where the questions we were wrestling with here at Harvard and Sanders Theater have a kind of immediacy and power that those of us in Sanders Theater have the luxury of viewing from a certain distance. And so I think this is a powerful question. In a way, it's related to the question we were discussing earlier about civil disobedience. At what point does a conscientious citizen conclude that the law or the established political arrangements are sufficiently unjust that some form of civil disobedience is justified? That's a hard moral question, but it's also a very hard personal and political question, because depending on the regime, the consequences can be very dire. So I think it's a matter partly of prudential judgment that depends on whether whether one's fellow citizens are gathering and organizing to try to raise a serious protest, as we've seen in Iran, and including several years ago after a disputed election. It takes tremendous courage to engage in political protests in societies where the consequences of those protests can be quite harsh and severe. So I think that this is a hard question of political prudence and judgment, as well as being a terribly important question of justice and of morality. And to really discuss it in greater depth or with greater concreteness, I would want ideally to sit face to face, or to be able to engage in a dialogue, a deeper, fuller dialogue with people who found themselves in this situation. I don't want to sit here without being able to see someone and to engage in further discussion than our current method of communication permits. But I would want to say how much I admire the question and the moral passion and commitment that lies behind it. And I hope that there may be an opportunity in the future sometime to continue these discussions in Iran. I've not had an opportunity to visit Iran. To meet with those of you particularly who have taken the course and who are wrestling with these questions as applied to the Iranian predicament.
We're now going to move on to the second part of our event. These are your responses on the discussion forum. So we'll begin with the first question, because so many people were interested in the NSA controversy.
Yeah.
So here's a person who's in favor of what Snowden did. Carolyn writes, as one of the other students commented, I believe the question for individuals in this case is how you can decide whether something like this is just or unjust with imperfect information.
Right.
How, in the modern society that we live in, can we trust the media to give us enough impartial and accurate information to make decisions about justice?
Well, Caroline raised an important question. We do have imperfect information. We always have imperfect information when we're trying to decide hard questions about how to act in the world. But it's certainly true that what the Snowden case raises is the question of how fully informed we are and how good a job does the media do in making available to us the information we need to deliberate as citizens about questions of justice and the common good. I am among those who don't think the media, by and large, is doing a very good job of providing forums for the kind of discussion we need in democratic societies. And I think we need to explore ways of improving the media, creating new forums for serious public deliberation on questions of justice and the common good, including the kinds of questions that have arisen in the Snowden case.
A person raising an objection to what Snowden did,
Yeah.
Joe. Joe writes, Snowden was in no position to decide on his own the value of the revealed information. What he did was put at risk lives from terrorism. He was a small actor with only a bit part. If he objected on moral grounds to the government eavesdropping, he should have just resigned his position. Do you have a reply to that?
Well, resigning in silence, of course, is different from an act of a public act or from an act of civil disobedience. And because he's fled, as for reasons I discussed earlier, this is not a classic case of civil disobedience. He doesn't want to go to jail to answer for the act of civil disobedience. But one of the difficulties is, one of the arguments against, one could make against Snowden is, was he in a position to evaluate the risk in lives of divulging this? Now, the administration seems to feel that this does undermine national security in the fight against terrorism. But we as the public are not really in a position to evaluate that argument, just as Snowden himself was not. Neither are we, because we really haven't been told very much about how the system worked and how successful and how necessary it was in preventing terrorist attacks. But I'm hoping that the public debate that follows will enable us to learn more along these lines so that we can evaluate assessments of the kind that Joe presents, as well as the kind of arguments made by Snowden and his defenders.
And here's another person who's writing in defense of Snowden's actions,
Yeah.
Brian. Brian writes, yes, it was important. There are 26 senators who are now pressing the NSA to explain their interpretation of the various laws, such as the Patriot Act and FISA.
Right.
Previously, there were only 2 senators who were trying to raise alarms, but they could not proceed because they were bound in a catch-22 situation.
Right.
By releasing this material, Snowden has broken a knot that was preventing a democratic discussion on these policies. He also has a sort of...
He was making possible the democratic discussion, and that's what Joe is, who is it?
Brian.
That's what Brian is saying.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Brian seems to have a second point, which I'll try to cut a little shorter, which is that we should sort of ignore, or rather not focus on the drama, the questions of, him fleeing and so on.
Right.
We should rather look at this more as a matter of just what happened, not any individual actors.
Right, right. Well, it's true that a lot of the media focus has been on the flight and the extradition attempts, swirling about Snowden himself. But I agree that the bigger issue is the one that follows upon the revelations themselves. Is this intelligence gathering method defensible or not? That's the bigger debate. And how to answer that debate. People have given different answers just now, writing in online. But I think that should be the central debate, and we do tend to get distracted by the admittedly dramatic aftermath of the revelations, which has to do with, where is Snowden, and will the United States succeed in bringing him to trial in the United States? Will Russia give him up? So there's a lot of drama in that narrative that I agree runs the risk of distracting us from the broader public debate we should be having.
Okay, the next response is again raises objections to Snowden. Trying to go back and forth.
Yeah.
Lawrence writes, I wonder about the utilitarian argument against Snowden's actions. I understand the course has thoroughly challenged the utilitarian philosophy. However, it seems to me that there is still much to be said for danger posed to citizens' lives by revealing the system to terrorist organizations. My question is, what harm is done by the privacy invasions to the majority of citizens who have nothing to hide, especially if the information is de-identified?
Right.
Would not the effect, the potential for pain caused by a terrorist act that would have otherwise been caught greatly outweigh such harm?
It might, but here's where we really don't know and are not in a position as citizens to assess just how important this program was to preventing terrorist attacks. I'm hoping the administration will, in making its case, provide more information about the benefit that this intelligence gathering method has achieved, and not only showing what it's done to help keep the country secure, but also, is it a necessary way? Is it the best way of doing that, or are there less intrusive ways of doing it? That's a fair question, and that's a fair debate. As it's also fair to ask, and I think this is a close call, a contestable question, if no one is listening to what I'm saying on the phone, and no one is reading my emails, is it the same kind of violation of my privacy if they accumulate records about the number of calls I placed in to where and for how long? It does seem different, and yet it is a kind of intrusion on privacy. But I agree that we do need to make the kind of weighing that that the question suggests.
Mm-hmm. The next, so we'll take a step away for a moment from the NSA controversy. It's in response. The next post was in response to Arjane's question, the second question about organisms.
Right.
T.P. Keenan writes, to your comment that a less painful killing of an animal is somehow morally superior to a painful one. He talks about a book that was recently written which suggests that genetically engineering cows that were incapable of pain might be immoral because it would diminish our own sense of responsibility for what is still killing.
Right.
How would you react?
Right. It might be that maybe that was my book that's being referred to. I don't know. But I was among those who, I'm among those who worry about genetically altering animals to make killing them, well, at the extreme, the question is, suppose we could create a genetically altered cow that had no head and therefore no brain and no eyes and therefore could not anticipate death at the slaughterhouse. Would that put to rest the objections to factory farming? Now, it would make the cow less aware of its impending slaughter. But it might also desensitize us. It might use our technological prowess to manipulate nature in a way that made us indifferent or insensitive to the act of killing an animate creature. And so I do take this I do take this objection seriously. And I think what it suggests is that pain is not the only thing that matters morally, even when we're speaking about how we treat animals. There is a certain kind of respect and integrity that is at stake in the way we treat and regard animals, even when we're using them for our purposes, that I think can't be and shouldn't be extinguished or laid to rest if we could find a way genetically of manipulating the creatures that we want to use. So I take the force of the question, and I think it's not a simple matter. I accept what I take to be the view of the questioner, that it's a mistake to think that pain is the only thing that matters morally when we're treating even non-human animals.
The next response is actually from Mitch, who asked the fourth question about the roommate.
Right.
He writes, I regret that I cannot agree with Professor Sandel's response. Loyalty to those in the club,
Right.
when the insiders behave in an unjust way,
Right.
is equal and identical to disloyalty to those outside the club. There's no doubt in my mind that we feel a sense of loyalty. Civilization poses us a challenge of how to respond with loyalty in a way that does not silence our personal sense of justice.
Well, I certainly agree with Mitch that we shouldn't silence our personal sense of justice. I think that would be a mistake. The question is, what does justice require of us? And does it sometimes require special obligations of us in regard to our family members or friends or compatriots or fellow citizens? Special obligations. Not to extinguish the duties of justice we owe to human beings as such. I think Mitch is right about that. The question is, can there ever be a tension between the duties we owe universally and the special obligations we owe members of our family or our community, our people, or our country? And I think there can sometimes be tensions of that kind, and I'd be interested if our method of communication permitted a more immediate kind of dialogue. I'd be interested in asking Mitch whether he thinks there can never even be a moral dilemma or a moral conflict between our duties to human beings as such and the arguably special obligations we owe to family members, friends, fellow citizens. But that's how I would frame the issue. I would not want to be understood as suggesting that the special obligations we have to our, say, fellow citizens extinguish or should lead us to ignore our obligations to humanity as such. In fact, sometimes our identity as members of political communities may give us a greater obligation to right an injustice against some other community. And we discussed this in the class when we discussed whether there are historic obligations that reach across generations. I think we discussed the example of the Vietnam War. Do I, as an American who believes the Vietnam War is unjust, do I have a special obligation to try to bring that war to an end? An obligation that's greater than the obligation that some other conscientious person, say in Sweden, might have, who also considers the war unjust? I would say yes. I would say that sense of belonging matters, but it matters to justice. It doesn't matter in opposition to justice. It matters for the sake of explaining what justice requires of me. Do I have a special obligation as an American to right the wrongs and remedy the legacy of slavery and segregation that other conscientious citizens of other countries don't have, even though they might deplore slavery as it existed in the U.S.? I would say yes. So I think special obligations of membership are connected to justice, not opposed to it, and yet they sometimes can give rise to moral dilemmas of a more universal kind.
I think we have time for one more response.
Okay.
And it'll be from the NSA questions.
Yeah.
That's what people seem to be very interested in,
Yeah.
passionate about right now.
Right.
So James asks, or he writes, "It seems to me that the question should be, is secrecy morally acceptable? Information empowers, and by hiding information, you are actively disempowering people.
Right.
Defending secrecy with, quote, but the other side has the secrets too, does nothing to defend an immoral action. Is it morally right for a government to withhold information from its people?"
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it can be. Now, the NSA case may not have been a defensible one. That's open to legitimate and serious debate. But would you really go so far as to, who was the questioner?
James.
James, would you really go so far as to say that, let's say during World War II, when the Allies had cracked the German codes and could therefore predict when missile attacks would come or bombing runs from the Nazis, would you really say that there was an obligation, above all, to publish that information, to put it in the newspapers? No, there was, I think, a compelling need, and there are compelling needs for government secrecy. I don't think that pure transparency permits the conduct of government in the public good. There are cases, especially in wartime, where secrecy is necessary and unavoidable. But we may have overdone it. And I think the sympathy for Snowden, including among many of you who have posted responses to our Snowden discussion, suggests that a great many people may feel we've overdone secrecy in ways that have ill-equipped democratic citizens to have a serious discussion about the right way to make this country secure, the best way to combat terrorism without violating liberties and without violating privacy. So we may have overdone it. And there may be a tendency, I think there is a tendency, for governments to overstate the need for secrecy. And I think this can undermine legitimate democratic deliberation and questioning of government. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that secrecy is never justifiable. I think clearly there are cases where it is and where it's important. I would just like to say, Ben, first of all, I want to thank Ben and the Justice X team for the tremendous amount of work that they devoted to make this discussion possible, but also the entire course possible. I would also like to thank all of you who have participated, who posted questions over the past several days, who joined in this discussion. This is a good first step at creating online live discussion about the philosophical questions we've been studying throughout the online course. It's only a first step because I'm hoping that we will soon be able to have a way of going beyond people simply posting questions and me answering. Ideally, I would like to make this a two-way, a live, immediate, real-time, two-way conversation. I think the technology exists to do that. It will involve some further development and experimentation, but I hope that before long we will be able to do this in a way that is live, immediate, in real time, to extend the very good discussion we've had today, thanks to you and thanks to Ben and the Justice team, about some of the very concrete, immediate, pressing public questions that I think we notice more and question more, having studied together the philosophical questions and texts we've done throughout the semester. So thank you all very much. Thanks to you, Ben, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.